the largest surviving colonial empire still existed and has been existing all this time right in front of our eyes. What is happening now in 2025, done by Russians in Ukraine, is nothing different about it that what was done during the colonial conquest of 19th century and before. The tactics are the same, the approach is the same, the formulas, the playbooks are all the same, and for Russians they haven't changed for at least a century or even more. So this is something that we should and must talk about, that this job hasn't been finished and we're still allowing this kind of a crude imperialism, colonialism happening and unfolding before our own eyes.
Maksym Eristavi is a Ukrainian journalist, writer, and author of the award-winning book Russian Colonialism 101, an illustrated guide to Russian colonial crimes. His current mission is to create global awareness about the Russian colonial legacy.
Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English. Today we have very special guest, Maksym Eristavi. And Maksym is a Ukrainian journalist. Reading his quick bio on his Twitter, he's the storyteller-in-chief and author of award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. And we're going to get into what that is today and how that came to exist. But Maksym and I crossed paths back in 2015 when I worked at Hromadske in Kyiv. There was an English language show called The Sunday Show, and Maksym was the executive producer, and he ended up hiring me to be on that show. So we worked together for several months in Kyiv shortly after Maidan. And yeah, it's really cool to have you on the show now. I feel like we've sort of come full circle in a way. Here I am doing Talking Ukraine in English when we did the English language Sunday show. So it's really cool to connect again and have you on.
Thank you so much. That's 100% mutual, and it brings back so many great memories about the Hromadske and how it became this fantastic hub, not only connecting Ukrainian journalists in general, but also then having this little family of Ukrainian diaspora people who would come all over the world, and somebody from the United States, Australia, South Africa, like everybody of all backgrounds who would gather around. So that brings lovely memories as well, and happy to be here.
Well, let's go back into your backstory a little bit. How did you get into journalism, and how did you get involved with Hromadske? Were you there at the very beginning? Did you come on board with the Sunday show? Like how did that, how did your journalistic career merge into Hromadske?
Well, I mean, Hromadske was kind of this, I know that people do not use this word hipster anymore, and it's kind of severely outdated. But back then at mid-2010s, right after the 2014 Maidan Revolution, Hromadske was this fresh, young hipster startup in journalism who tried things differently, who would bring more honest, truthful, and more real type of journalists who would appeal to young people, to young Ukrainians first and foremost. And also it would be at the end of the year of severe repressions and severe censorship that existed for Ukrainian journalism during the times of the pro-Russian regime of Viktor Yanukovych before. So, I mean, my path in journalism is 20 years. And Hromadske is just, one of the chapters in it. But I think every journalist at that point who was in Ukraine kind of naturally was drawn by this project. It was a prototype of public broadcaster owned by journalists and designed by journalists to do the public service for democratic society. And at that point, there was nothing else. And for me, it was a dream come true. After working in journalism by that time for almost a decade, I was finally happy to see somewhere where I can, find a home as a journalist and do stuff that I would always dream to do and make the type of journalism that I would really love to do. And I'm happy that I had this opportunity with Hromadske for several years because it did shape me into journalist of today as well. Keep staying true to that kind of storytelling that centers and keep in focus the service for the public. And every time I try to to tell story or report or write, I ask myself what kind of service I do for my audience, what kind of added value I bring, what I can be of a value and service for them as a journalist. And that was shaped by trailblazing experience at Hromadske, Ukrainian revolutionary time journalism of early 2010s.
Yeah, and I remember when I got there feeling that it was very progressive because social media was sort of traditional media was not really using social media at that time, but Hromadske was pretty actively. We did like short clips for YouTube and social media and Twitter, and that was a big part of Hromadske's outreach. And I just remember, yeah, feeling like, okay, they're trying new things and really using the new technology. I mean, I remember you got me onto Slack, and I was like, oh, what is this platform? Like feeling like, like, oh wow, they're using this new stuff that I didn't even know about. I was a little older maybe than everyone there at the time.
I'm not sure about that, but definitely, I think there was another part of this journey that I really appreciate because um, it had to do a lot with decolonization as well. And I was involved in running the newsroom for foreign audiences, right, for international broadcasting. And as a young journalist coming and thinking, well, we need to build up this voice, Ukrainian voice, talking back to the rest of the world on the topics that we as Ukrainians find useful, in the language that we find the correct one. And of course, you come, and as a young journalist, I was really under impression that the journalism in the West is done better, and the best thing that we can do is to replicate some of the ethics, some of the production techniques, to make the sound and feel as good as our Western colleagues do, right, on covering Ukraine. And during the course of that journey, I proved myself wrong about it. I realized how how bad or how wrong oftentimes the coverage of Ukraine was by Western newsrooms, how distorted it was, how it wouldn't represent and wouldn't deliver to foreign audience the picture of Ukraine that I had in mind as a Ukrainian, the picture of Ukraine that Ukrainians had, the messages that Ukrainians want to convey to the rest of the world. So when you would read and you watch stories about Ukraine on lots of foreign media outlets, that wouldn't be the reality that we're lived in at the moment, and that wouldn't be the topics wouldn't be that important that we wanted to tell the rest of the world. So in those short several years, I also kind of realized the extent of the problem that we had with coverage of Ukraine and how people completely missed the point that what was happening already in Ukraine in 2014 will have profound consequences for the rest of the world in the coming years. And unfortunately, part of the problem why we ended up in 2022 with a full-scale genocide in Ukraine is also lies on the responsibility of foreign media that didn't do exactly the best job of covering Ukraine and explaining it to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, do you feel like the foreign media at that time maybe focused too much on these like hot button stories like, oh, there's some extremists in certain militia groups and that's the sensational story and that's what's going to get clicks and that's what they were focusing on, because we had the format of the Sunday show, which was a more in-depth sort of talk show, but that's a very niche audience for that, people who want to do a deeper dive into Ukraine, similar to this. You're not really like attracting those people who aren't interested in Ukraine, or are invested in Ukraine already, right? So that those were the buzz stories that I feel like were sort of focused on a lot at that time.
Absolutely. I think like even us rediscovering the proper language to use to cover what is happening in Ukraine. One of the most, kind of two biggest, largest examples would be Exhibit A is the usage of proper geographical names that would represent, Ukrainian language and Ukrainian identity, like Kyiv instead of Russified Kiev, and geographical Ukrainian names spelled in Russian way in abroad instead of spelled indigenously and authentically in Ukrainian. Or, for example, to the point of, for example, centering on 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Lots of foreign media would call it a crisis, or would use the language designed by Russian propaganda in Moscow, such as separatism, rebellion, rebels, describing basically a covert Russian invasion of Ukrainian territories as something that has nothing to do with Russia, and using language that would whitewash the Russian responsibility in what was happening. And I think even I remember we had these debates. On one hand, you have to reach for an audience, and you have to play along with news algorithms on social media platforms and use the language that would be instantly recognized, and hit the buttons of context for the rest of the foreign audience. On the other hand, you have the problem that this language is wrong. And this language contributes to the problem. This language contributes to the culture abuse. This language is created by the abuser. And if we don't name the things by their own names, and we don't speak the truth, and we don't use the language that describes this truth as accurately as possible, we are part of the problem as well. So those were very complicated decisions to debate and juggle for young journalists as well. And I think, part of the reason, not the part, the larger part of the reason who I am right now as a journalist is because of those discussions and those realizations and decolonization even moments that happened in that newsroom at that time.
Yeah, this makes me think as you're talking that, there were like all these reports about what's really happening in Ukraine, in more mainstream Western media. And then you'd have, but Russia denies it, but Russia says this. And there was always like, I'm like, why are you, like what the truth is, but you still have to repeat Russia's official position, even though it's not the truth. But somehow by stating, stating it in the way that they were stating it, it's like you're giving it equal balance, even though it's a lie. And that's what always sort of pissed me off about like reading these stories. It's like, oh, they just have to like, I don't know, they try to be like objective by saying, but Russia's position is, but there was so much evidence that they're just blatantly lying. That's what was frustrating for me.
It's a huge problem of false balance that still exists in lots of specifically Western newsrooms to this very date. And this is large part of the reason why there's so much outflow of audience from these mainstream or establishment media outlets, because for various reasons, but because people kind of see little value in just consuming news that present you with this absolutely neutral, false balance, even that is just a collection of opinions of different fringes, and there is no centered force that will try to help me to navigate through especially complicated issues, especially something that I have no personal experience of relating to, like, for example, a Russian invasion of Ukraine. If I'm not a Ukrainian, or I have no one who I know who is Ukrainian. So in this case, once again, the newsrooms fail their audience, in trying to break down complicated things into something that is digestible, but also keeping in mind, okay, what kind of service I'm serving you? Am I pointing out to the most important things in all of this, or I'm just registering what I'm seeing, basically as a goldfish, and saying, well, person A said this, person B said that, and I just happen to be in the place to register all of that, and I'm bringing you back. Whatever it means, whatever the context is there, it's not important. This is what the second of reality that I captured for you. So here you go. This is my piece of journalism for you, which I find absolute garbage and having zero public value for anyone who's consuming that. In my opinion, the role of journalists is to bring context and to bring added value and realization to the people why we're covering this topic, what kind of importance it has, what kind of depth it might have that as an audience might not register at first. And this is where journalists should supposed to stand for, and this is where kind of I'm as a consumer of journals would like it to be. And I just don't see it very often abroad.
Yeah. I remember at that time, I thought Vice was doing a pretty good job with their sort of video vignettes from different journalists that were out in Eastern Ukraine and presenting it. I felt was a little more in depth and accessible to like maybe a younger audience. At that time, I felt like they were doing a better job representing the story than traditional media were. I mean, would you agree with that?
I mean, 100%. When I generalize about the media outlets, it it is not to devalidate the outstanding work of some of the individual reporters and journalists, foreign journalists that would do the coverage of Ukraine. There were plenty of them, and being in the same environment and having non-formal conversations with them, you would also know how much struggle they also had fighting for the stories that they felt like are important, fighting for the language with their editors to use the right language in covering Ukraine and covering the Russian actions in the region. That was a daily struggle. That is still a daily struggle for many of them. So I always try to amplify their work individually, even if I may criticize the outlets in general for their tendencies, editorial choices that they make regarding coverage of Russia. Brilliant foreign journalists working in Ukraine at the moment, doing terrific reporting. As much as there are so many fantastically brilliant Ukrainian journalists who do a terrific job telling the rest of the world in Ukraine in foreign languages, which was again not a case when we started Hromadske. And I think part of the legacy of Hromadske at the moment was to bring more local voices to reporting in English and foreign languages, and ensure that these stories are told by the journalists and by the people who are actually living them instead of just witnessing them.
Yeah, so what after you left Hromadske and before the war started, what were you focusing on during that time in those years? Like where were you? What were you working on, or what was this Russian colonialism project something that you were already had in your head that you were already actively working on, or was the full scale invasion sort of like the Kickstarter for that?
Mm. I think my path in journalism started with the same kind of questions and same kind of unanswered questions that I'm trying to fill gaps with it today as well, with the work on Russian colonialism, because as most of Ukrainians, you grew up in the families that are severely affected by colonialism, by identity erasure, by Russification, and you have so many gaps in the knowledge of who you are and where you come from. What's your history? What's the history of your own land, your own family? And I became a journalist because I started asking those questions of people around me, my family, and running around with a tape recorder and trying to ask like where we come from, where's our grandfather, or why I speak Russian, you speak Ukrainian inside our own family, and stuff like that. And I just didn't get any questions, any answers for lots of that, and I think it extended for me trying to get larger context and trying to connect the dots between all these seemingly unaffected events, and then living through revolutions and seeing this more aggressive and aggressive encroachment of Russian imperialism on our country. It was all started clicking for me into one cohesive picture where Russian imperialism and the practice Russian colonialism is reshaping our past and our present, and it will reshape our future as well if we're not stopping it and we're not talking about its existence of this larger phenomena. And part of the journey of personal decolonization is actually to start clearly seeing the system that prevents you from reaching your full potential, that is designed there, installed there to ensure that you constantly doubt yourself, that you constantly, feel inferior in many ways. And you feel like at first it's your own problem, but then you start seeing other people struggling with the same. And then that's now on the level of nation. And then you start talking to other people who happen to be unlucky to live next to Russia, and they also tell you the same stories, and they also share very personal, similar experiences of surviving Russian oppression and identity erasure. And then you understand, wow, there's a much larger problem out there that the rest of the world does not really talk about. And when I start trying already to pitch those stories to foreign outlets and try to focus on it as much as possible, or even in regular Ukraine coverage, and I've been doing, for leading newsrooms around the world, try to bring that context, I would be laughed at by editors saying, well, that's not a real thing. What are you talking about? Russian imperialism. This is just, some nonsense. We won't be covering it. Or those who would be more sympathetic would say, like, this is so dense, nobody would ever care about it. So just leave it behind. That's why for me, it became increasingly isolated experience to do it through establishing media. And instead, I started doing it on my own and trying to build the audience around it that would be interested in it. And that's how it became the central topic of my work. And it's very much personal and very much central to what I see is kind of wrong with the world's perspective on Russia, what it is, what it does, and what kind of history it has.
Yeah, so you're from Eastern Ukraine, and I imagine there's a lot of people of your generation that have sort of had similar feelings and experiences growing up in an independent Ukraine, but having parents who lived in the Soviet Union, and grew up in a more Russian-centric world, but then rediscovering like this history, right? So when you say your audience, I mean, were you also connecting by doing this with other Ukrainians, like say your peers, or was this was this in Ukrainian, or was this English, or both? Like who, were you more focused on a foreign audience?
I think there is such a brilliant generation right now of Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainian influencers, Ukrainian public figures who are leading the conversation about decolonization within Ukraine. Voices like, for example, Mariam Nayem or Bogdana Nebarak, who are also setting the new standards for inside a conversation in Ukraine about decolonization and liberation, or this unapologetic manifestation of Ukrainianness, what it means. So I find my niche. I will always find my niche to connect with foreign audience more, and I see still the problem that the majority of people do not understand that Russia is an empire. And it hasn't been limited just to Putinist Russia and Soviet Russia and the Imperial Russia before that. And it's just all the stages of the same problem and the same phenomenon, the same evil that just changes the names but never changes its nature and its playbook. But when I started this work and I started learning even myself about more stories that are coming not from Ukraine, but also from other dozens of societies affected by it throughout history, I started realizing that we, even ourselves, do not understand the extent of the crime that was committed. On so many book shows, people come and say, even if this guidebook covers just 1 century of Russian invasions, just this one aspect of Russian imperialism, they had no idea that there are so many nations were affected, sovereign nations were affected, even with the span of 1 century. And we're talking about the empire that existed for 400 years at least. So I think for us to learn more about the names of those victims is also important. For those victims, for those nations who were abused, it's important that they've been heard and their names been heard, because all of it kind of feeds into the justice of their justice of hearing their stories, because so many of us don't have zero idea about what has happened, even within inside our families. If we're struggling with that, you can imagine that we still have so much to learn about what was happening just next door.
Yeah, I mean, for me growing up as a first generation or second generation Ukrainian American, what's happening now is like deja vu of what happened to my grandparents, during World War
Mm,
II. And for me, Russia was always like this empire, Moskali, as my grandparents used to say that. And so when I, first came to Ukraine and I saw people were sort of like neutral or they'd say, "Oh, we never expected this would happen." I'm like, "What are you talking about? Like this is their game plan. This is like what they do." Like for me it was like that's just like what it was in my DNA that the stories that my grandparents had told me. So what's happening now is not, I mean, I'm surprising it's happening on the scale that it is. But Russia's intentions, always were
mm.
clear to me. But yeah,
Well, maybe because you had this, privilege to have those stories discussed and shared within the family. When during the Russian occupation of Ukraine, any the level of terror was such of huge scale that it was dangerous to talk about your own roots within your own family. So when I even already growing up during the independent years of Ukraine, and I was trying to ask my grandparents about what has happened to some of our family members, and lots of them disappeared overnight, right? Because there were during the Holodomor genocide in 1930s committed by Russia that starved millions of Ukrainians. Then the following terror, the complete annihilation of Ukrainian elites, but then on lesser scale, but still constant disappearances, executions, and sending people, predominantly indigenous people, to concentration camps in northern Asia. That was all created to such a atmosphere of fear within the families that it completely was taboo to talk about the past. So I remember, asking my grandmother what has happened to our grandfather who disappeared overnight, and she would give these vague responses, one sentences, liners, something like that. And then on the same time she would say like, "Oh, I don't remember much," or "This is just what happened and that's it." And at the same time she would have these very detailed memories to share of some random days, like for example, I mean, not not random, but still, like she got her first got her first job, or her wedding, or when I was born. And it was all disconnected for me. And like I was asking myself, how could you remember something like that in such a detail? So you do have a very good memory. On the same time, one of the probably most traumatic events in your life, such as Holodomor genocide, or the war, or disappearance of your husband, you cannot give an answer. And only with time I understood that this fear that, God forbid, I tell something to this young generation that will limit their opportunities in life, because they will understand that there is a history of repression within the family, that their family was deemed not good enough or dangerous for the imperial regime. That will definitely impact their lives, that will endanger their lives, definitely. So it's better for them not knowing at all and try to assimilate as much as possible. And for you to assimilate, to speak, perfect Russian, to have an opportunities within the metropole, to have a good career, you have to completely abandon your roots. You have to completely denounce them. And was just a protective mechanism for lots of parents. And within one generation, that entire knowledge is gone. And it's never recorded anywhere. And we don't know anything about what happened even to our families because of that. So that's why I call it a privilege, not in a negative way. I really appreciate the value of a diaspora to bring back us those stories that were in some ways were completely lost within our own families because of this terror and regime of fear.
Yeah, in the early 2000s, I videotaped some testimonies of Holodomor survivors that were in the States. Had been living most of their lives, lived through the Holodomor. They were young, but lived most of their lives in the United States. But they hadn't really talked about it with their families, and but they were at this point in their lives. They've lived in America most of their lives, and they were near the end of their lives, and they were willing to discuss it. So, we recorded like 15 sort of interviews with these people who previously hadn't really told their story. But we wanted to record it just to document it. And that was interesting that, yeah, like their kids didn't, they knew generally, but they didn't know all these details.
Well, absolutely. And I also remember that, of course, you had no way of connecting. And that's another triumph of colonialism in a way that for younger generation, there was no way for personally connect to those really tragic, horrible stories that your grandparents and grandparents even had to share. And when the full-scale genocide started in 2022, now there's so much more interest to the stories of survivors of Holodomor genocide of the 30s, those few who remained. Or there are these fantastic projects launched a decade ago that started documenting the stories of survivors, like the Holodomor Museum, which is fantastic resource available in English as well, where you can learn lots of those personal stories. And the tragedy of it, that when you hear those stories and now you see the reality of what is happening on the Russian occupied Ukrainian lands, and those stories match almost sometimes one to one to the extent of evil and terror and the horrific, horrifying things that are done to Ukrainians in 2025 and were done during the 1930s. And the tactics and the reasoning for it is still absolutely the same. And for many young people, the realization of this horror that, oh my God, once again, another generation of Ukrainians had to go through the same just because the rest of the world didn't care enough to punish the previous crimes or to address them in any way, serve any justice, is just so vivid, and nothing that I would imagine would ever happen to make it kind of a more relevant even to our own lives and our own experiences of today.
But like you said, at 2025, it's unthinkable almost that this is like a reality that's happening. And I think maybe people in the West are detached from that reality, like because it's not happening to them or people they know. And so it's hard to even like really comprehend, that this is like horror that's real. So yeah, I mean, why do you think like this is the tactic that Russia uses? I mean, is it, like, okay, let you have this book. I have it here.
Yeah.
and in the you have your sort of template here for like Russia's tactics and colonialism for different territories: gaslight, invade, exterminate. I mean, this is like their operating system is basically, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
basically what you're trying to show here. Like, to talk a little about, you know, this book. Why did you put this together?
Uh, yeah. I think one of the biggest tragedies that somehow we convinced ourselves that things such as imperialism and colonialism are things of the past, and they happened maybe some time ago in 19th century or 20th century, and we're all, as a global society, international society, dealt with it completely effectively, and it's part of the history books, and we don't have to live that horrific barbarity anymore. Whereas the largest surviving colonial empire still existed and has been existing all this time, right in front of our eyes, doing the same kind of barbarity of 19th century style. It's not even neo-colonial. Some people, come to book shows and say, well, it's great that we talk about neo-colonialism. And I always disagree. I'm like, what are you talking about, guys? What we're describing here, what is happening now in 2025, done by Russians in Ukraine, is nothing different about it that what was done during the colonial conquest of 19th century and before. The tactics are the same, the approach is the same, the formulas, the playbooks are all the same, and for Russians they haven't changed for at least a century, or even more. So this is something that we should and must talk about, that this job hasn't been finished, and we're still allowing this kind of a crude imperialism, colonialism happening and unfolding before our own eyes. And with this book, I specifically wanted to bring everyone's attention to this pattern of behavior that kind of exposes this colonial regime in more approachable way. So first of all, it's an art book, right? So it was each chapter, each example of Russian colonial invasions in the last 100 years are illustrated by Ukrainian wartime artists. And it was important for me to make an art book out of it because I feel like more people can connect with this very dense and complex topic through art first, and kind of discover this through the power of anti-colonial art and artists that were creating these illustrations while being bombed in another colonial war and while trying to survive another colonial genocide. And once people are connected with this very powerful art, they then more open to discover and to see a larger picture, that it's not only about Ukraine, and what is happening in Ukraine at the moment has happened many times before, not only to Ukrainians, but also it has happened to other dozens and dozens of other nations following the same playbook and resulting in the same horrific crimes that were never addressed, never uncovered, and nobody ever was punished for them. So this is my goal with this book. Is doesn't answer all the questions. It's not an academic work. It's just a conversation entry for a lot of people to start seeing things differently and bring that context that is virtually missing or has been missing and almost all reporting about Russia before. Now it starts appearing slowly, and the words like imperialism and colonialism start slowly appearing in the context of lots of reporting on Russia, but hasn't been the case up until quite recently, and that's part of the reason why we're seeing another genocide unfolding.
Why do you think Russia operates this way? Like, is this unique to Russian society? Is this just like a, a human, a need for nation states that have the power and ability to conquer smaller nation states? Is that just like what they do? Like historically, that's what they've done, right? I mean, there's been the American Empire or the Spanish or the British and that sort of thing. But is there is Russia just part of this, like, empire nation states that exist in human society, or is there something that's different?
Mhm.
in Russian society, or the way the Russians, maybe do that, the way they, you know,
Mm,
I mean, I sort of feel it's almost like an addiction, right?
mm.
They get addicted to this empire mentality and power, and the society in general, like just supports that.
Well, I don't know how can I tell you this without sounding too depressing, but for me to explain it even to myself, I think we need to go back to the level of just general abuse, why abuse happens. And abuse always happens because of an existing power imbalance. And if abuser is not punished or not brought to accountability, this will create more abuse, just because, unfortunately, abuse is part of the relations between people in many ways. And the fact that there is, some people become abusers is just because they're allowed to by the rest to continue and carry on. And if you just extrapolate it to abusive relations between the states or imperialism in general, that also breaks down to the accountability. If there is no accountability, there is no culture that shames this kind of behavior, the abuse will happen because, of course, it brings very specific benefits to the abuser. In case of Russia, it's mostly wealth. All that we name Russian oil and Russian gas and all these insane natural resources. Nothing is Russian about them. They're all stolen from indigenous colonized lands in Northern Asia or Eastern Europe, and it brings huge profit as we speak, still, despite the sanctions, despite the everything. So it's economic benefits. It's also cultural benefits because everybody in the world knows about so-called Russian culture, but nobody knows about Ukrainian culture or Georgian culture, Kazakh culture, just because, you know, the Russian culture was existing in this uncompetitive environment where other indigenous cultures were erased or eliminated, or our artists, our writers were killed, executed, and therefore it allowed the for Russia to establish this soft power cultural flex, right? To have this great culture, but nobody asks the questions why there is a great in that name, just because there was not a fair competition in the first place. So there are lots of benefits, of course, behind imperialism. That's why it thrived for several centuries elsewhere. That's why you named so many other countries that engaged in it. And some are keep engaging it, not only Russia as we speak, but other countries in the world. Maybe not in such scale, maybe not with the 19th century style barbaric playbooks, but still. So the problem is not so much with once again, with any specific people or any specific rulers, or once again with a bit context-less coverage in the world, in foreign media. You might get an idea that, well, if Putin is gone, tomorrow is going to be different, Russia, and everything will be back to normal. Whereas we're talking about the problem that existed, the culture of abuse that existed for several centuries and has never been shamed, never been addressed, and never faced any justice and accountability. And while that kind of culture exists for several centuries, it's not going to be enough to replace just one man or one woman or one person at the top to change it. We need to start being real about the changes that need to happen for that culture to stop existing. And other colonial countries went through similar processes. All empires always fall. That's just the historical fact and tendency. But in a way for them to start cracking, we need to at least acknowledge their existence, which hasn't been the case for Russian Empire for way too long.
Why not? I mean, do you think it's just easier for people not to acknowledge it? I mean, I guess I've been surprised how much pushback there is. This situation seems very black and white to me. It should be black and white, like what's going on, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But, in the social media sphere online, you'll see a lot of pushback on like what's happening from people in the West who sympathize with Russia. And I used to think, okay, there's just some Russian trolls, but I think there's a lot of, or a certain percentage of people who somehow subscribe to these like Russian, reassertions of what's real, and maybe Russia's had this benefiting from the going back to the Soviet Union way of just like controlling their information space, and with the new technologies, they'd be able to permeate Western society more so than before. I mean, going back to like the journalism aspect of this, I mean, it seems like that's a very powerful tool that Russia has today that I'm surprised about. I mean, have you noticed that in what you're doing online, and like why do you think that is, and what is this should be so black and white? I guess going back to like why are so many people like so susceptible to this
Mm.
like Russian disinformation?
Yeah, of course. I think the question is more about us in the West, why we're such a mess in the first place in terms of just being so played out by disinformation in general, why it's so easy to plant ideas in our heads that have no factual basis whatsoever, why it's so easy to do with young people, especially, which is completely horrifying. If we consider how much affected by disinformation, how much susceptible they are to disinformation these days, why there's such a disregard or lack of any value in critical thinking in the first place. And the one of the biggest, if not the biggest, successes of propaganda in recent maybe centuries is the success of Russian propaganda, of designing this mythology around Russia that paints it as something other than it is, that paints it in different historical eras differently. So we have this massive empire, the largest empire by landmass existing at the moment. Even if you're just a person with just really basic critical thinking and you look at the map and you can locate Russia on this map, you can see that in no way in the entire human history, in no way such countries of such size were created in friendships and hugs and people joining in love. It was always empires brutalizing their way to this size, brutalizing the neighbors and colonizing and conquesting. So you look at the map, you already start asking yourself critical questions about how this ginormous country has happened. You probably arrive at some basic conclusions. And this is not happening for too many people. And then this Russian propaganda mythology that dates back centuries. We start from, even the Russian rulers such as Peter I, and how he paid money to European intellectuals to tell a different story of Russia as this, civilizing, enlightening power with great culture that just, once again appeared magically there, and everyone's so happy living under Russian rule. And European intellectuals such as Honoré de Balzac and others who started just, spreading these lies all around, and it became part of the canon of how Russia is perceived. And once again, has nothing to do with the reality of how people lived and how the state came about. And we talk a lot and sometimes mention the power of Nazi propaganda, right? And the Goebbels, and how it was so effective at recruiting millions inside Germany, but also recruiting so many outside. These very viral pictures these days of anti-war protests in the United States with posters "Why to attack Hitler? Let's negotiate with Hitler." It also was a result of this effective propaganda that was infiltrated the West. But Russia was one of the states who started World War II together with Nazi Germany. And, for several years, they were brutalizing and abusing nations in Europe together, hand in hand with Nazi Germany. And they were responsible for starting Holocaust as well. But in the end, thanks to the genius of Russian propaganda, today the majority of the world thinks that Russia was, this main victim in all of it, and had no responsibility whatsoever, and helped to bring down the Nazi Germany. So I think the power of propaganda is, of course, to the credit of Moscow, and to the credit of centuries of very effective disinformation campaigns. And if Russia mastered anything, it is disinformation and propaganda at the scale that probably Nazi Germany and Goebbels would be really envious of. On the other hand, this also exposes really painful questions about what the hell is happening within our societies, why there is no immunity towards the information, why critical thinking is not valued, why we have entire departments in our universities who would just, replicating, spreading the same propaganda lies created in Moscow several centuries ago, instead of actually doing research and critical work on exposing the patterns of abusive behavior behind Russian Empire.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for this accountability to happen, or some sort of processes of change to happen within Russian society, I've talked about this with other people, like Russia needs to lose, and they need to, lose this war, significantly. And it doesn't seem like that's possible to happen because the West doesn't really want to get that involved. Europe and America, they're kind of like, well, it's sort of our problem, but it's not our people, it's not our border. We'll tacitly do the right thing and support, but we're not going to risk lives. And I mean, it's come to from my point of view that Ukrainian lives are expendable for the West. Like Ukrainian lives don't value as much. They're not going to come in and actually do what's needed for this defeat to happen that could maybe hold Russia accountable and force some changes within Russian society, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is how do we either have this change, or like how do you see things going forward, or what would you like to see happen? I guess there's like the theoretical, what would you like to see happen? And then maybe how do you think this is going to play out, or given the realities of today?
I mean, the guidebook opens with one blank page with one phrase, which says the empire will fall. And for me, when I was writing this, I was manifesting wishful thinking on one hand. On the other hand, it was a fact that I wanted to state right in the beginning. All empires always fall. This is just a natural process of their development. There hasn't been a single empire that didn't face that in the end. So we need to remember that all the time. And one of the successes of the empires, once again, is to exist thanks to the culture of abuse and culture and mythology around it, convincing us and convincing people who are not only abused by an empire, but also who live next to empire, that it's there forever. That is just, the given fact that nothing will ever change about it. As long as this culture and this perception exists, the empire is safe, and it can replicate itself, and it can renovate, it can just keep existing. The moment this perception changes and people start imagining and discussing the future beyond empire, beyond abuse, this is where the first cracks appear. And when I was putting together this book, and some people, come say like, well, this is just 48 invasions, but in the span of 100 years, that's just overwhelming for some people, depressing because they haven't realized the extent of this abuse happening. But there are also chapters there that actually show you examples of resistance and pushback that were successful. In places like Lithuania or Estonia or even Ukraine during the independence war of beginning of 20th century, where despite all of the odds, there was a resistance, and people fought back, and they succeeded, and Russians were kicked out, and these victories of small, unlike resistance, started the snowball of rapid demise of Russia as an empire. That process wasn't finished, but it had happened on many occasions where Russia was close of collapsing as an empire. And I think that it's important to remember those stories, to get inspired by those stories, but also as one of the icons of um, historical research of Eastern Europe, Timothy Snyder warns in all of his lectures that we also must remember that all empires will always fall. It's just the first step for us is to realize and to see this future where there is no empire, and to start asking questions: what's next? And are we prepared for this? And are we prepared to face that reality? And I think it's also a question for Russian society and those holders of Russian passports. Unfortunately, not many of those 140 million people can talk about seriously about what it's like for Russia to be beyond empire. What is Russian culture beyond imperialism? What is Russia beyond holding so many colonies still in Northern Asia, as it does today in Eastern Europe? It's also the job that Russian society needs to go through.
That was sort of my next question that I was thinking about, is like, if you had all these people, Russia's forces are concentrated in Ukraine. If you had, say, Chechens rising up now, or some of these indigenous people, further out in Asia rising up now, but there doesn't seem to be that sort of organization or desire or resistance. I guess, I don't, I haven't delved into this topic, so I don't know, but I don't see anything happening. Are they, has that been sort of killed off, this desire for independence, or has that, because now would be a unique opportunity to seize for the breakup of some of these territories, right? If they were willing to try, but it doesn't seem like, that's something that those societies are organized and have a motivation to do.
The guidebook ends with a phrase that disarm, partitioned, and decolonize Russia is the only peace plan that will ever work. Because once you go through all these examples, you understand the pattern of behavior, understand that to break this pattern of behavior, the empire must go. But the empire will go only when, always all those people, nations that are still colonized by Moscow will also have an opportunity to be sovereign and independent once again. And without it, there's going to be just a repetition of the same cycle of abuse, maybe under other regime. I want to ask you another question. How often actually in the coverage of Russia abroad do you see and you hear the voices and the names of representatives of indigenous nations that are currently colonized by Russia?
Never.
Never, right? And how often when any word Russian opposition is mentioned, how often you hear mentions of only white Russians from around Moscow named, anyone from Navalny's fund and anyone else who's considered in the West as the face of Russian opposition. And I think this is where, once again, the problem starts with perception of Russia abroad. Why they don't see those faces? Although speaking in majority terms, they represent the actual opposition within Russia. There are groups and there are movements, there are faces and voices and academics and experts and opposition leaders who are actually representing real Russian opposition and who talk about decolonization, autonomy, the return of sovereign rights, the return of opportunity to vote for sovereignty, to act at the empire. Those conversations are happening, maybe not at the moment, at the, at the level that, for example, Ukrainians would love it to have, because Ukrainians are actually fighting with for their lives with arms in their hands. Um, but there exists, and the problem that we ask ourselves such questions is because there's zero coverage and there's zero representation of these voices. And when we talk about Russian opposition or the future for Russia, we talk about the people who actually know better than Putin in their views, and they support imperialism, and they cannot imagine Russia not being great. They cannot imagine Russia not being the biggest, largest country in the world. And they replicate basically the same imperialism nonsense that the entire ideology of Putin is based on. So we just need to start hearing those people and treat them seriously and give them the platform they deserve. So for the rest of the world can also see the world beyond Russian Empire, and those people already discussing what it could look like. We just don't hear them, or we refuse to give them a platform in the West that they deserve, or abroad in general.
Well, the first thing is you have to have the idea, you have to have the discussion. So I think, you're definitely part of that conversation with the work you're doing. If people listening to this want to keep up with you, how can they find you? You have a Instagram, a Twitter, a Substack newsletter, right?
So I'm blessed that we are able to kind of build up on the guidebook and expand it into a storytelling hub and support other storytellers and journalists who also trying to cover different aspects of Russian imperialism and colonialism. So we've just finished a fantastic audio show called Matryoshka of Lies based on the book. And there's an entire storytelling hub, Voля Hub. You can basically find all this kind of informations and ways for you to engage, involve, buying a book or listening to audio show, subscribing to some newsletters at my website, maksymeristavi.com, or you go to russiancolonialism.net. It's kind of a small hub where you can find all the ways to start educating yourself and learning about this phenomenon.
I mean, it's impressive work that you're doing, I have to say. I mean, very well researched and detailed and necessary and difficult, so it's important, especially someone of the younger generation who can sort of speak to their peers of that generation, as opposed to just having these older historical professors talking about it, in some dry lecture hall presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, that's very mutual, and thank you so much for inviting, and once again, giving the platform for such topic. And it's always a pleasure chatting with you. And I think that's a very important, valid point you're raising. I think when we talk about things that are not happening with us, it's important to stay human about it and to stay centered in the human experiences of people who are actually lived through it. And when I want to debate Russia or China or imperialism or colonialism, I should ask myself first, have I heard enough from people who have these intimate experiences of living through it to form an opinion? So my opinion is not dry or conceptual or just based on some opinions that I have, but it's based on actual human stories of people who lived through it, survived through it. Because at the end of the day, in my work, I want to point out that experience of colonialism is first and foremost a trauma, and it's an abuse. And a way for us to tackle any abuse and trauma, we need to listen to the survivors and victims first, to learn more about it and give them the platform so they can tell their own stories first. And only after that, we can help them and we can help ourselves to design a way how to end this abuse. And unfortunately, when we talk about Russia these days abroad, it's very dry, as you said, very conceptual, very divorced from reality of actual of actual human lives and actual human tragedies that people need to go through for us to, keep tolerating this. So this is where I would like people to go direction I would like them to take and learn more about these human stories first, before forming their final opinion on what is happening now in Ukraine and what is happening with Russia.
Yeah, I think if you tell human stories, stories that are personal and more relatable, that has more success in engaging people than sort of like, oh, here's the numbers of people and statistics and things like that. People just sort of like disengage, or they're not as pulled into the reality or of comprehending what's really going on. So
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's fine not to know everything. Absolutely. And, it's fine to admit that I don't know about something, about some issue, and I'm not a huge expert. That's why there's a work of people like yourself. We're trying to educate people and to help them to find the right facts and right perspectives and learn the right context.
yeah, well, everyone does what we're best at doing and capable of doing, so that's what's going to make Ukraine see the victory and become the great society it deserves, and I truly believe that you could, the future potential in Ukraine is huge based on the population and the people and how much they care and care to contribute to their own society.
Absolutely. I mean, and the first step towards ending Russian colonialism is indeed only through Ukraine's victory. So this is the priority number one for everyone who's truly feels like they're anti-imperialist or anti-colonialism. This is indeed should be their priority number one to help Ukraine win.
Доки всі сплять, доки сонце іще не зійшло, гине вогонь, догоряє остання лампада, де той літак, що світанком візьме на крило і понесе, там, де небо, тепло і зорепад, доки всі сплять, доки тиша скрипить за вікном, холод весни заповзає в кімнату над раннім, де той вокзал, що покличе сигнальним гудком і проведе між одвічними вперше й востаннє, доки всі сплять, доки сон обіймає рідню в світлі вогню, ти ледь чутно виходиш з кімнати, сонце встає, йде назустріч наступному дню, а літаки паротяги чекають команди рушати.